I'm Ryker, this is Kristin, and
Hey.
This is part 2.
It is. It's part 2.
Yeah. So on Sunday we talked about Esther and what her big what's were.
Yep.
I think Esther was a person who started out in hiding, but she came out in boldness and was able to show God's grace in a way that no one else did.
Yeah, totally. I think in the story of Esther, it's actually really cool because it's like such a transition from start to finish. Like her character gets developed so much throughout the story. And like we were talking about in the sermon, like her identity and all that stuff, it started out as almost like she wasn't sure who she was, kind of back and forth between whoever was directing her. And then she went into this position of being secure in who God had made her to be and like her purpose that he had for her, which I really like, because I think a lot of us need to have that in our own lives, like that journey from this position of not knowing who we are to that position of being secure in who we are and then being able to step out in boldness, like you said.
Yeah. She really understood that her actions would have a great effect. And like I think that really helped her to get over her butts about like but she doesn't know who she is. And
when Mordecai was speaking to her, he was like, if you don't do this, like he kind of gave her like this caveat of like, if you choose not to step up, like if you don't, there's still going to be help that comes to our people, but like you're not going to get to be a part of it, and you're going to have repercussions because of that. Like there's going to be consequences, right? And so she recognized, like she was weighing the odds, right? Like on either side, she's like, well, if I don't help my people, there's consequences, but if I do help them, then there could also be consequences, right? But like she recognized, like you said, like the value in doing the right thing, and that whether there's consequences or not, it outweighs the good outweighs the bad in that, right? So
can you tell us a bit more of the history and like how before Esther became the queen and stuff?
Sure, yeah. So at the time when the king had already had a queen, like Vashti, right? There was this big party going on in the kingdom, and he had invited all these very wealthy like lords and people that he had in positions that were higher, and he was partying with them, like drinking and partying for 180 days. Which, I mean, when you've been drinking and partying that long, it's not the best time to make like life decisions.
Right.
But that tended to be how they did it back then. Like in Persia, it was like you had political meetings, you had like meetings about, you know, what you were going to do next, your next steps, while drinking quite heavily. They would actually wait until they were drunk to make decisions like that. So anyways, it says here, he was actually drunk, like he was in high spirits from wine. And he calls his Queen Vashti, to come before him. And some commentaries say that he asked her to come wearing only her crown. It says to come wearing her royal crown, but some people think that she was offended because he was asking her to come before him and all of his friends that are drunk, naked and just wearing her crown. Be that as it may, she wasn't too happy about the idea of parading herself among all these drunk people, and so she says no. And it's funny because like it's not even through, he doesn't even come and like ask her personally. He like sends these eunuchs to go talk. And if you don't know what a eunuch is, I mean, like I couldn't go into that on a Sunday morning, but look it up. But it's basically a castrated man who is human. And the eunuchs weren't allowed to men weren't allowed to be in the presence of any women in the harem unless they were castrated, because the king didn't want any illegitimate children in his harem, right? And so all these men who are working in the palace are not allowed to have their parts. And anyway, so he sends these eunuchs over to ask Vashti to come before him. Asks her to come, and she says no. And so he's frustrated and he's embarrassed because he's like in front of all these people, all these like men that he wants to like impress, and he's not able to get his wife to listen to him. And so he calls like the council together, like all of these men that are drunk, and he's like, what do we do about this, right? Like asking them, and they're all like I said, they're not having clear thoughts. And the men are like, well, if Vashti can say no to you, all of our wives are going to think they can say no to us. Like this is in there. This is in chapter 1 of Esther. So if you don't do something about this, there's going to be like a revolt, and women are going to start thinking they have a voice, and how dare you, right? Like, and so they're like, you need to get rid of this girl. Like, you can't have her as the queen. There has to be consequences. And so he says, come before me. She says no. He says, you're never allowed to see me again. Her consequences are basically that what she wanted, which was she didn't want to see him, right?
Right.
And so she gets kind of like taken out of that position as queen and ends up living somewhere else, probably in like a pretty nice area, because she's still not allowed to be remarried. She's still technically like his property, but she's not queen. She's not his wife, so she's just being taken care of somewhere else. And so, that was, I thought, really crazy.
And later on, it seemed kind of like Haman was trying to, like, molest her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was kind of strange, like, how it came up. I remember reading that for the first time and being like, that doesn't really make sense to me. Like, this is a man who has just found out he's going to die. And he's like, all of a sudden, that would not be my first thought of something I would do, right? Especially, like, to anger the king more. It's not like he's super far away. He literally just put his drink down and walked outside. And, like, to do that in that kind of scenario doesn't really make sense. Yeah. And so, kind of looking into it further, you see that, like, in just before that happened, he said he knew that, like, Xerxes had already sealed his fate, right? He's like, I'm already, like, I know I'm going to die. The only one that he could appeal to was Esther. She was still there. At that time, the law was that no one could sit on the same couch as the queen. Like, you could not recline on the same, like, at meal times they would recline while they ate. And you could not, like, sit on the edge of their couch. You couldn't, like, touch their couch while they were eating. That it was just, like, one of the laws, right? And so Haman is on her feet, like, on the couch. Like, he has crossed some lines. Yeah. But he was not molesting her in the way that the king was saying. Really, kind of what was going on here is Xerxes goes out into the garden and he thinks, okay, how do I was the one who sealed this decree. I told Haman he could do it. And I just said, I just found out my queen is one of the ones that's going to die. This makes me look pretty stupid, you know? And so he's thinking, how can I completely pin the blame on Haman? How can I have, like, a scapegoat here? And Haman is the one that he goes to. So he comes in and he's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. But he sees this little, like, thing going on with Haman and the queen. Yeah. And all these servants are around. And he's just like, how dare you molest the queen? You know what I mean? Like, like, how dare you? And then, like, because that was, like, so against the law, he has to be killed, right? And so they take him out. Yeah. Like I said, they couldn't have anyone other than male eunuchs around the queen for a reason. So it was taken very seriously when someone was, like, trying to press their attentions on the queen or any of the, like, women in the harem. And so he was killed for that, but really Xerxes was looking at it from the perspective of, how do I get out of this and not look stupid? Yeah. Right? So
I really liked at the end of your message you brought up the fact that we really need to understand grace.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely like it's like the starting point, right? Like when someone comes to Christ, it's because you understand that grace, right? You understand that you're a sinner, you understand that you've messed up, and that he's given you grace, right? Yeah. And so you come to the cross, but sometimes I think along the way, you kind of forget what was paid for you, and you start either thinking, like, sometimes you can think, well, look at all those bad people out there, almost forgetting what you used to be like, or that you deserve, that you needed grace. And then you start looking at people and you're, like, critical and judgmental, right? And, like, forget what was paid for you and forget that Jesus actually, like, sacrificed himself for your sin as well. Or you can go the other direction and be like, man, like, God, I shouldn't have your grace on my life. And you forget about forgiveness. You forget about grace in the sense of, like, you don't accept it, right? You just refuse to accept it into your life. And you just kind of beat yourself up and live under your sin, under the condemnation of sin. And so the thing I really liked about it is that even though Esther did really awesome, like, in the fact that she stepped out in faith and she, like, did the right thing in that scenario, she didn't take it the next step, which is what Jesus did. Jesus was like, I'm actually going to die for those who are opposed to me, right? Like, Haman is Esther's enemy, and he's Esther's family's enemy, like Mordecai. Yeah. Haman wanted to kill her adopted father and, like, impale him on a pole. And if she had, that would have been so crazy. Like, I can't even imagine that being the end of that book, right? Like, if Esther had just been like, stepped between this wrathful king who's looking for a scapegoat and stood with Haman and said no. Yeah. And like I believe it's a really good picture of like Jesus and God, right? Because there's this wrathful king in heaven who there is going to be, you know, like punishment, right? Yeah. And the choice is, are we going to allow Jesus to pay that price? Or are we going to not accept that grace? And are we going to pay the price ourselves, right? Yeah. And so Haman, he actually accepted, or he did not accept that, right? And he faced Xerxes, like that wrathful king on earth. Right. And then he died and he faced God. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, which he is even more wrathful and more angry, right? And so it's this idea of like Jesus atoning for and like stepping between us and what we deserve and actually giving us grace. And I really like that that's kind of almost embedded throughout that story. And you can see how Jesus did it better, right? Like Esther was great, but Jesus did it better. Yeah.
I think it's pretty awesome that Jesus took the payment on the cross. Yeah. Even though we deserved punishment, he didn't at all.
No, not at all. Yeah. And it was crazy just because actually the way that they would kill people, like the impaling thing, it was like 50 cubits high, which is 75 feet. And so Haman actually built this thing. Like he built it in order to kill Mordecai, who he saw as his enemy. A little background on that I didn't really get to touch on was that Mordecai actually, because he would sit at the gate, he actually heard two soldiers discussing an assassination plot. Like they wanted to kill Xerxes. Yeah. And he heard them and he actually reported it and saved the king's life. Yeah. But nothing was done, right? So it wasn't like he was rewarded or anything like that. Nothing happened. And then just before Haman comes in to actually ask if he can kill Mordecai, King Xerxes reads in his like log and it's like, Mordecai saved my life. And like he's like, what was done? Like nothing was done for him, right? And so it's just God's timing, right? Like he works through the whole book, because like how would that have happened? Like just the night before, like Haman comes in to literally ask the king's permission to kill his enemy Mordecai. The king reads, Mordecai saved my life, and nothing was done for him. And so the next day, Haman comes into the outer court and he has to wait to be summoned, right? Because like we learned, you can't just go before the king. So he waits out there, and then he gets summoned by Xerxes, and Xerxes says, there was a man. He wasn't specific. Yeah. He's like, a man that I want to honor. And Haman's thinking, that's me, right? Like he's like, who else could the king possibly want to honor, right? Yeah. Like I am so amazing. Yeah. Right? And so Haman's thinking, it's me. I'm going to tell him like exactly what I would want, right? Yeah. So he's like, put on like your best robe. I want to wear your best robe that you've worn before, and I want to ride your horse that you've rode before, and all this stuff. And I want someone to lead me through the city and call out to everyone, this is what happens when the king wants to honor someone. Right. And he's like, I just want it. And so but he didn't say me. He's like, I would do this, right? Yeah. Like kind of made it, you know, chill. And he's like, yeah, I want you to do that for Mordecai. And so Haman's just like, oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I wasn't going to kill him or anything. That was not going to happen, right? And so Haman has to personally put on Xerxes' robe onto Mordecai. Yeah. He has to lead him around the city on a horse and exclaim out loud, like, this is what happens when the king wants to honor someone. And so like that pole that he had, you know, put up in his yard waiting for Mordecai to die on it, now it's just standing there. And at the end of that kind of like turntable situation, that's when Haman gets impaled on that his own pole, right? Yeah. And so it's just kind of a crazy turn of events that happens throughout there. And like, you don't really see much grace over Haman's life, even though he's a lot like a lot of us, right? He's done things that we probably, you know, maybe have done, we've thought about doing, or whatever it might be. He's been prideful, just like me, just like you, you know, just like everybody, right? Like, and so he's done all these things, but he didn't receive grace. And I think that the key point from that whole message was just, he didn't receive grace, but we get to, right? And like Jesus actually wants to give us the same grace, and everyone the same grace. Like even people who still act like Haman all the time, you know, even us when we act like Haman, you know, and so all those different things, like he's not the enemy, right? And so Jesus gives us kind of an idea of that grace throughout the end of that book, and I really like it because really God's name is not mentioned in that book.
So, it's interesting.
Like I read through the whole book because I read a commentary that said it's not in there, and I was like, no way. Like I read through the whole book looking for the name, and it was not in there. And there's actually no like even relation to anything religious. The closest that they get is fasting.
Right.
Which is like a Jewish custom. So they say like 3 days of fasting, but there's no talk of prayer. There's no prophets. There's no teachers.
Yeah.
It's just, but you can see God so clearly throughout the whole book. And I think that's why I love it so much. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Was there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think that's it.
Awesome. If you like this video, hit the like button down there, share it with all your friends, and I'll see you next week for part 2.
See you next time. Esther's great.